Picture this, it's December 1935. The streets of New York are buzzing with Christmas shoppers. Inside one of the city's produce markets, vendors are unloading crates before dawn. Trucks rumble in, men shout prices across the room, restaurants are preparing for the holiday rush. Then the doors swing open. In walks New York City Mayor La Guardia, not with a shopping list, with police officers, and the room falls quiet. The mayor announces that effective immediately, the sale of baby artichokes in New York City is illegal. Police begin confiscating produce. Vendors stare in disbelief. Some are threatened with arrest. Others watch thousands of dollars worth of vegetables hauled away. Why, you ask? Well, hold on to your pedals because we're diving into the Great Artichoke War. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the show where we explore the strange intersection of food, history, and true crime. This week's episode started on one of my favorite drives in California. Every time I head toward the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is in Monterey, California, I pass field after field of artichokes. They are literally everywhere, and every single time I find myself wondering who was the first person to say, I want to eat that. Because they're kind of weird, they're spiky, you have to boil them, you scrape them with your teeth, you throw half away, and most importantly, you have to decide between butter or mayo as a dip. If you have strong feelings, I want to hear it. Add a comment on which is your favorite. But they're considered a delicacy. So today, we're diving into a super interesting story because, sidebar, I recently got reviewed by the awesome people at City on the Edge podcast. They talk about Albuquerque, New Mexico. Super cool. I listened to their episode about horses. Highly recommend you go check them out. But one thing they said is that sometimes I'm a little light on the crime, which 100% true. Sometimes for me, the crime is the hook. Sometimes it's the whole story, like today. Because when I went looking for a simple farming story about artichokes, I found the Mafia. First things first, I needed to understand what the Mafia even is. Because I've watched The Equalizer with Denzel Washington, 1 and 3, where they are prominent figures in the plot. But I myself did not know what the difference was between a mafia and a gang. So after a bit of Googling, here's what I found. Also, for the sake of not being targeted by any one of these allegedly. Okay, from what I can find, a gang usually controls a territory. Call it a neighborhood, a street, maybe a city block. Within that territory, they'd make their money through drug trafficking, extortion, human trafficking, and armed robbery, selling counterfeit goods. The Mafia is a little different. It's maybe fair to say they think or act a little more big picture. Also, Mafia isn't the only word, it's just the one that I tend to be the most exposed to. Another example would be the Yakuza. So for the Mafia, instead of asking who controls this corner, they tend to ask who controls this business. They're kind of like, we want to make money every single day. A morally questionable version of a side hustle via something like taxing garbage collection, extortion through construction jobs, leveraging shops for money laundering, or in the early 1900s, it's rigging vegetable prices. Violence happens across the board, but for organized crime, it was usually a business tool to gain control. Because if you can control an entire industry, people keep paying you whether they like it or not. So, how did artichokes become an industry worth controlling? And to answer that, we got to go back a little further than 1930s. Despite looking like some type of medieval weapon, an artichoke is actually a flower. How sweet. Specifically, the unopened flower bud of a giant Mediterranean thistle, or also sometimes called, I think, a cardoon. And if farmers don't harvest this thistle in time, the tight green bud opens into a spectacular purple bloom covered with hundreds of tiny flowers. Let me just say, she's gorge and bees love her. By then, though, it's too tough to eat because of our friend fiber. Thus, humans have been selectively breeding these plants for thousands of years for something with larger buds, thicker hearts, mercifully fewer thorns, and more edible flesh. Throughout this process, I just love the idea that there's someone standing over this thistle and going like, I will make you edible at some point. But the ancient Greeks knew about what we call today the globe artichoke. In fact, according to Greek mythology, the artichoke got its name from a woman named Cynara. The story goes that Zeus fell in love with her, but after she snuck back home to visit her family without permission, he got mad and turned her into a thorny thistle. Might we say this is an overreaction and riddled with red flags? I think so. But if you've read enough Greek mythology, it's kind of on brand. Either way, the Romans loved it. And in fact, wealthy Romans believed artichokes could improve digestion, increase fertility, and even work as an aphrodisiac. But to be fair, artichokes are rich in antioxidants, fiber, vitamin K, and folate. In case you don't know what those are good for, I did some Googling. Antioxidants get rid of things that make you feel bad. That's the simplest version. Fiber helps your gut. Folate helps with pregnancy, and vitamin K supports cardiovascular health. I don't know, maybe they were onto something, you know what I'm saying? For me, artichokes hold a simple and loving place in my heart. After a little snip snip and boil boil, you've got yourself an entertaining and delicious snack. And the best part of it is absolutely winning the fight against the feathery fluff and getting to the heart. That feathery fluff is, of course, the unbloomed flower. By the Renaissance, artichokes had become associated with luxury dining across parts of Italy and France, and eventually they made their way across the Atlantic. Artichokes, they don't love extremes. They thrive in cool Mediterranean climates with mild winters, sunny afternoons, and coastal moisture, which describes my favorite state and much of coastal California, especially we of the north. We love fog, we love a bit of dunes, and we love the absence of snow unless we go to the mountains, and we love the humidity from the ocean. So Italian immigrants arrived in the late 1800s and recognized that places like Castroville, which is near or part of Monterey, looked remarkably similar to parts of the Mediterranean where they farmed for generations. And today, California produces the overwhelming majority of commercial artichokes grown in the United States. No brag. Those fields I've driven past for years, they're part of a farming tradition that's well over a century old. But California wasn't where the crime happened. The crime happened 3,000 miles away in New York, and this is because of immigration. Now, Italian immigrants didn't just bring fantastic, fabulous, and flavorful recipes. Italian immigrants also brought farming knowledge and, perhaps most importantly, a demand for artichokes. Italian neighborhoods throughout New York already knew how to cook and appreciate artichokes. So restaurants wanted them, families wanted them, importers wanted them. The problem was that artichokes were expensive. They still are relatively labor intensive today for a few reasons. But one is that there isn't a machine to harvest artichokes. And that's because every bud on the artichoke plant has to be harvested by hand because each one ripens at a different time. It's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. Workers have to return to the same plant again and again throughout the season, which adds cost. Then, after getting harvested, the vegetables had to survive a cross-country journey before refrigeration was anything like it is today. Not to mention, I'm guessing a serious lack of shock absorbers in whatever vehicle they were. So we're talking like horse-drawn carriages or like super long trains, but apparently refrigerated rail cars were available by the early 1900s and then trucks for shorter hauls. The thing is, all of that is relevant for why the Mafia targeted artichokes. Because of all the foods in New York City, it's not just the flavor profile of artichokes that attracted the Mafia. Just like now, back in the 1930s, most of America's artichokes were grown in California. Every spring, huge shipments arrived in New York, where they were distributed to wholesalers, neighborhood produce markets, and restaurants. The problem was that the fresh artichokes were incredibly perishable. Once they were harvested, everyone in the supply chain was racing against the clock to get the artichokes into the hands of the consumers. That means everybody in the chain felt pressure, and shop owners couldn't afford to let them sit on the shelf for days because they'd spoil before anybody bought them. And that urgency created an opportunity. Instead of growing artichokes, the Mafia allegedly focused on controlling who could sell them. By inserting themselves between suppliers and neighborhood markets, they could demand that vendors buy through them at heavily inflated prices. Refuse, and your shipment might never arrive, or your store might have a few unexpected problems. Because there were so many independent produce stores, and because everyone needed fresh inventory immediately, it was difficult for any one business or owner to push back. Paying the higher price often seemed safer than risking to have nothing at all. Now, one of the men who allegedly recognized that opportunity was Ciro, the artichoke king Terranova. And if you want to visualize him, just make sure the eyes don't point the same direction. And maybe that was just like a way for him to keep people guessing, but Terranova was already involved in organized crime. But instead of simply stealing produce, they forced wholesalers and vendors to buy through his organization. And if you refused and didn't have someone like Denzel Washington waiting in the wings, your business might suddenly encounter problems. Maybe your deliveries disappeared. Maybe customers were intimidated. Maybe your suppliers stopped answering your calls. Extortion is a game of persistence. So eventually, reports suggested that prices skyrocketed because the market itself had effectively been cornered by the mafia. People weren't paying more because artichokes suddenly became rare. They were paying because competition had disappeared. And that's a question I kept asking myself. Like, if everyone knew this was happening, if this was an open secret, why didn't someone just arrest them? Because proving extortion, as it turns out, is much harder than proving theft. Why? Because victims are often afraid to testify. Businesses depend on keeping their doors open. Some feared retaliation. Others may have viewed paying as simply the cost of doing business. And the early 20th century had already shown how powerful these organizations could become. So what changed? What took the mafia off of artichokes? You know it. I know it. When the United States banned alcohol in 1920, nobody listened. People didn't suddenly stop drinking. Instead, an enormous illegal market appeared almost overnight. Organized crime groups made fortunes producing, transporting, and selling alcohol. They developed distribution networks, bribed officials, learned logistics, expanded influence, and so when Prohibition ended in 1933, those organizations didn't disappear. They simply looked for other profitable businesses, including what? The artichoke. Which brings us back to the Mayor La Guardia, whose first name I believe is Fiorello, which is just an absolute joy to say. Now, I have no idea, or I had no idea who La Guardia was. All I knew was that in that airplane movie with the pilot who was Tom Hanks, he mentioned Teterboro Airport or La Guardia. So anytime I've even just booked flights, La Guardia is the only thing I know. So I did a little Googling, and here's what Wikipedia says. An American attorney and politician who served as the 100th mayor of New York City from 1934 to 1946. He was known for his irascible, energetic, and charismatic personality and diminutive, rotund stature. Now, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, I don't know what will. From what I can tell and the fact that his name is on an airport, he was a big deal. As the son of Italian immigrants, he seemed to genuinely give a shit about his community. And when you think about the fact that the mafia, in this case, is associated with Italians and he's dealing with Italian immigrants, like he was in the thick of it. But in this case, he showed his care with a little bit of Game of Thrones strategy. So rather than chasing every individual involved with the mafia, because again, remember, they have their fingers in every possible cookie jar. They don't put pressure on one person, they put pressure on the entire chain of people who might be associated with any type of business. And then they go for your friends and your family, or that's what I hear or see in movies. Either way, La Guardia said, hold on a second. He thought to himself, well, if no one could legally sell artichokes, then there would be no more market left to control. Thus, the opening story. He came in, he said, you cannot sell artichokes. He temporarily banned the sale of baby artichokes throughout New York City. Again, that's why the police confiscated shipments, markets were raided, and apparently this worked so effectively that within only a few days, the entire racket collapsed, and pressure was so high to have the artichokes back that the ban was lifted after a few days. So, besides knowing that an airport was named after him, we now also know that La Guardia had a few green flags. Or maybe green vegetables? Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.